this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with a short breakdown of some of the cards that are going to become available here in Zendikar Rising, as it is being released on Magic Online today, as well as the pre-events for streamers is going on Arena right now. So a lot of people are streaming Standard and Historic. This video is going to be with an emphasis on cards for burn/prowess or red aggressive decks in general. The first card is Wayward Guidebeast. This is kind of an amalgamation towards Goblin Guide, but much worse. It's a 2/2 for red with trample and haste. When Wayward Guidebeast deals combat damage, return a land you control to its owner's hand. So the thing with Goblin Guide is Goblin Guide has like a whatever chance of flipping a land off the top of your opponent's deck. Not great. Card advantage for your opponent. Sometimes you can take advantage of the information of cards revealed, etc. Wayward Guidebeast is, at first blush, really not playable. The disadvantage of returning a land to your hand is quite high. I don't think a usual burn deck or usual aggressive deck can really take advantage. Now there are some situations, where like a burn deck gets stuck on one land. Sometimes you don't mind like returning a land to your hand, second main phase, being able to cast another spell. I think there are two types of decks that could take advantage of Wayward Guidebeast. The first one is a low to the ground like mono red burn deck. With like a bunch of 1-drops, things like maybe Goblin Guide, Swift Spear, maybe even Soulscar Mage, maybe even something like Blister Coil Weird, just kind of have an all 1-drop dot deck, and then playing like Seal of Fire, and so something akin to a Prowess deck, but not quite. I do think that is one deck that could kind of leverage this particular type of card. Another deck is, there was an old deck that was similar to Zoo called 8-Whack, and it was basically the original incarnation of goblins in Modern. It was a mono red aggressive deck. It played things like Goblin Guide, Legion Loyalist, and then the 8-Whack effects, Goblin Bushwhacker, and Goblin, I forget what the other one is. But basically it just played a bunch of really cheap goblins, like some Goblin Grenades, some Lightning Bolts, and these Bushwhacker effects. And then some of the versions of the deck would play things like Burning Tree Emissary to get an even bigger thing. And then there were other cards that you would see come in and come out. That's a deck that could operate on like 1 or 2 lands, and this is a card that if you sequencing like all your hasty goblins correctly, like maybe you can sequence this one last, and like return them out into your hand. Like say you keep a 2-lander, and on turn 2 you like Burning Tree Emissary, play this guy, swing with this guy, bounce the mountain back to your hand, and then you have your land drop for turn 3, ready to, or on turn 3 if you missed your land drop on turn 3. Situations like that, where it could be, as a supplemental threat, very advantageous to have another 2/2 powerful creature in that particular deck. And I think really those are the only 2 decks that I can think of that might be able to leverage something like Wayward Guidebeast. Card number 2 we're taking a look at is Magma Channeler. This is a 1/3 for 1 and a red. It's a creature wizard. As long as you control 4 or more instants or sorceries in your graveyard, Magma Channeler gets +3/+1. It also has the ability tap, discard a card, exile the top 2 cards of your library, then choose one of them. You may play this card this turn. So effectively, in some regards, this is, I guess the closest akin cards to it would be something like Dreadhorde Arcanist and Jace of Vryn's Prodigy. Both have seen play in different formats. JVP has seen moderate play in Modern over time. Dreadhorde Arcanist sees play here and there in Modern. It's not really a staple. This card has a little bit more to it than either one of those cards at face value. It can easily be a 4/4 creature, especially in a deck like Burn. There are versions of Burn or Prowess that are more mid-range in nature, like the Red-Black Lurrus deck. I could see a deck like that leveraging some number of these. The thing is, it makes Burn a little bit more vulnerable to Graveyard Hate, where it's not really if it's running Luris. And this is very much a mid-range-ish card. I see this card having more impact on formats like Pioneer and Historic and Standard, where the formats are a little bit slower, the removal's a little bit worse. That said, this is a very powerful engine card if you can untap with it, but that's no mean feat in a deck like Burn. We do have some amount of threats that are must-answers, but, I mean, this is a very powerful mid-range card. But, like, you know, we don't really play cards like Jace Vryn's Prodigy, or there's another one that would occasionally see play. It's Satyr Fire Dancer. There's also a white card that gives all of your spells lifelink. I can see the... it's from the cons block that would, like, give your spells buyback and then give your spells lifelink. Soulfire Grandmaster. They're all very powerful cards, but they all require you to untap with them, and that's just not something you can guarantee in Burn. So I wouldn't see this as necessarily a Burn card, but it is certainly a card that I could see seeing play in the format and being quite powerful in certain builds. Alright, next card up is Roiling Vortex. This is probably the card that most Burn players have their hopes pegged on as the card that imports Sulfuric Vortex into Modern. Roiling Vortex, 1 red enchantment, beginning of each opponent or each player's upkeep, Roiling Vortex deals 1 damage to them. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast this spell, Roiling Vortex deals 5 damage to that player. Red, your opponents can't gain life this turn. It's a lot to unpack here. So, 1 red, deal 1 damage to each player during their upkeep. Similar to Curse of the Heartpiercer, a card that sees some play in Pauper Burn. Not a very powerful effect, especially since it's symmetrical, dealing us damage. Generally with Burn, we try to get ahead on life totals, so there are some matchups where we're going to get behind on life totals. This isn't going to be a particularly good card. But there are some matchups where that part could be quite nice against control decks, etc. The middle line is the one that is the most, like, hit or miss part of this spell. So, if a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast that spell, Roiling Vortex deals 5 damage. Okay. So, how many 0 mana spells or spells that are free are played in the format? As Burn players, Riftbolt. Suspend cards in general. So, Riftbolt, Greater Gargadon. Okay, not a whole lot. Force of Negation during our turn. That's kind of a big deal. Especially if the Uro pile decks are trying to not tap out during or tap out and then use Force to keep themselves alive during their turn. Okay, kind of a big deal. Cascade cards. Things you cascade into with Bloodbraid Elf, or Violent Outburst, or Ardent Plea, or Demonic Dread. So, has some random applications against some fringe decks, some decks that play cascade things. What other cards sometimes get paid for no mana? Surgical Extraction. Not exactly relevant to us, but I do know there's a certain sub-faction of Burn players, mainly but led by Poseidon, who like to play Surgical Extraction in their sideboard against Uro. Well, not really good with Roiling Vortex here. However, a lot of the Prowess decks like to play Gut Shot, Mutagenic Growth, etc. All of a sudden, it really doesn't feel worth it to take 7 damage to save your creature, now does it, with a Mutagenic Growth. And finally, one other deck, or other cards that you're going to see from time to time. So, Amulet Titan, Summoner's Pact. That's a big one. Cards, also Summoner's Pact out of Neoform. Also, whatchamacallit, the green life gain spell out of Neoform. So it hits a lot of random things out of Neoform if you can survive until turn 2. Also hits random things out of Ad Nauseam. Hits Lotus Bloom. Hits Pact of Negation. So the ceiling on that second ability is quite high in a lot of like random places. And then finally, red, your opponents can't gain life this turn. This card's not as powerful as Sulfuric Vortex on lines 1 and line 3. Or part 1 and part 3. Holding up red in the early turns is going to be very problematic, especially while you still have cards in your hand. Holding up 1 red to keep your opponent's not Lurrus. Even Lurrus. Lurrus is an Uros, and main phase life gain from, or their main turn life gain from happenings annoying enough. But then you start getting into things like Weather the Storm and Lightning Helix and such. And it becomes really hard to necessarily hold up 1 red, especially in the early turns. Things going on. Not saying it's not powerful. I'm just saying part of the issue with Burn is Burn has moved more and more towards sorcery speed things. Because in addition to Lava Spike, we're playing Rift Bolts, we're playing Skewer the Critics. There's a lot of cards that we can't play at instant speed and have to tap on our main phase. And it really kind of clashes a little bit with what's going on with Roiling Vortex here. Very powerful card. I expect to see a lot of sideboard play, maybe even some main deck play in certain things. But just keep in mind that middle line can affect us some in forms of Rift Bolt, and if you're playing like sideboard Phyrexian spells like Surgical Extraction. Another card that isn't necessarily burn related, but is a card that we might play from time to time in certain metas. Card Cleansing Wildfire. 1 in a red, destroy target land. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle their library, draw a card. The main application for this, obviously, kind of anti-Tron tech for some of the Jund decks, etc. Very powerful effect. But ironically, I didn't realize that there was a similar effect already in Modern. Geomancer's Gambit. It's 2 in a red for the exact same effect. But once again, that mana difference kind of huge. Being able to blow up a Tron land onto if you're on the draw is kind of huge. I don't know that Burn necessarily wants access to this effect. I mean, there are some lands we care about. Eldrazi Temple, some Tron lands sometimes, etc. And I'm sure there might be like some life gain lands sometime that we care about to blow up, or just setting back certain decks. But like I said, this is more for like mid-range decks, so something you might see out of Red-Black Lurrus, as they play a little bit more of a mid-range game. Definitely a card we might play from time to time, and definitely a card I expect to see a lot of play. And it's kind of crazy, like, how much that, like, 1 mana difference makes. This card was in Modern, and no one's played it ever, I don't think. I don't even remember hearing about this card, and it was in Modern Horizons. So, card you're going to see play, but we might play from time to time, but not something that is going to set the world on fire for burn decks in particular. Final card some people have talked about in some different shells is Scourge of the Skyclaves. This is basically Death's Shadow that takes into account everybody's life total. So it's 1 in a black, kicker 4 in a black. Whenever you cast this spell, if it was kicked, each player loses half their life rounded up. So that's an on-cast ability, so for some reason if you happen to get to 5, 7 mana, you can have your opponent's life total. Scourge of the Skyclaves' power and toughness are each equal to 20, minus the highest life total among players. So you're going to have to play a deck that's both not only lowering your opponent's life total, but also your own. So this obviously draws comparisons to the card Death's Shadow. Little bit different. I could easily see this as a card in like black-red burn. A deck that maybe is a little bit more aggressive with its own life total. So it could be like a mid-range threat for, or a mid-power threat for like Rakdos Burn, a reason to go into Rakdos. I kind of equate this sort of to like a Tarmogoyf-esque effect, especially in an aggressive red-black shell. It's a powerful mid-range beater, but much like Magma Channeler, kind of suffers from the... It doesn't have haste, and it doesn't have an immediate effect. So if something like Eidolon, if it gets killed, generally, it's at least dealing your opponent 2 damage. So I do think this is a very powerful effect, but once again, it's something like Tarmogoyf or that. So I could see it being played in more of like a Tribal Flames 3-color or like base 3-color deck with a little bit of like power to the mid game as the modern format continues to get grindier and grindier. But definitely a card that I wouldn't expect to see in traditional burn necessarily. But those are really the only kind of cards that I've seen that might have an impact on red aggressive strategies in the modern format. If you've seen any others that I might have missed, please consider commenting down below. And if you agree or disagree with any of my statements on any of the cards in this list, please also comment down below. As always, this has been John for MTG Nexus.